Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, the English novelist, painter, and poet John Berger once said, "The poverty of our century is unlike that of any other. It is not, as poverty was before, the result of natural scarcity, but of a set of priorities imposed upon the rest of the world by the rich. Consequently, the modern poor are not pitied, but written off as trash." Today, we're going to look at some of that trash. Stacey.
Yes, Max. Apparently, you know, in the United States, they call them trailer trash. And trailer parks are the new big investment for Wall Street. Trailer parks lure Wall Street investors looking for double-wide returns. First of all, the numbers. So roughly 6% of Americans lived in mobile homes in 2012, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Until recently, billionaire Sam Zell and a few other investors who run real estate investment trusts had the market to themselves. And in fact, on a 2012 conference call, Sam Zell said that we like the oligopoly nature of the business.
Yeah, these are trailer parks, right? These are people that are kind of pushed to the edges of town, and they live in a trailer park, and that phrase trailer trash, of course, is a popular phrase to refer to otherwise known as white trash, really, trailer trash. And so this is a hugely profitable business.
It's hugely profitable, and in fact, we'll go over the economics now of why Wall Street investors are getting into it, because there's a sort of stench, they think, normally, these Wall Street investors, to getting involved with anything to do with poor people and their ugly homes, right? So here we say that many counties in the U.S. have banned or discouraged construction of new trailer parks because the inhabitants are poor, pay little taxes, and drain resources. Yet demand is higher than ever because so many people never got back on their feet after the recession. So they, in fact, talked to one guy, David Protkivka. He's a former mortgage-backed bond salesman. And he said that he owns 4 trailer parks in Georgia. But he said that he's noticed that until 2008, most people coming into his parks were moving up. They owned nothing before buying a trailer. Now, since 2009, he said, half of his residents have come to him from conventional homes moving down. Mm-hmm.
So this is downward mobility. Essentially, you know, for years it was always upwardly mobile in the U.S., but now, you know, the upwardly mobile story has been eclipsed by countries in Northern Europe, for example. It's much easier to be upwardly mobile in Finland, Norway, Sweden than it is in the United States, where it's becoming really the path of least resistance is to become downwardly mobile as the economy continues to get drained of its vitality by these Wall Street program traders or high-frequency traders or house flippers or trailer trash flippers. Wherever there's a way to abuse the market, manipulate the market, in swoops these jackals.
Yeah, and I guess it would also suggest that 2009 was peak America, because if that's when they're starting to downwardly mobile people into trailer parks from homes. They previously lived in homes. Remember, that was the American dream. Part of the American dream is everybody could own a home. Now, the other thing about this is, so not only do you have restricted supply because nobody wants these poor people in their area, right? Well, on top of that, the beauty of a trailer park, for its owners anyway, is that once a tenant trucks a home to a site, then lowers it onto a pad, as it's known in the business, and hooks up to the electricity and septic system, he's unlikely to leave. It costs at least $5,000 to move a home, a sum that trailer dwellers rarely accumulate more than once, says Frank Rolfe, who is one of these investors in these trailer parks. And he says, we're like a Waffle House where everyone is chained to the booths. And this is why he's telling people to get into this business. You can't lose.
Well, we know on this show how the prison business has been privatized and turned into an extraordinary opportunity for Wall Street financiers. The financialization and privatization of the prison industry, Corrections Corps of America being the biggest in the U.S. Now we see the privatization and securitization and financialization of ghettos. So this is, remember, World War II, the Warsaw Ghetto, was famously created by the Nazis to push people into the ghetto out of the towns where they had all their wealth stolen. Now Wall Street's creating essentially trailer park ghettos, and it's becoming an investment vehicle. I've often said that if Goldman Sachs had had an opportunity to take Auschwitz public, that they would have done so. It's just that the mechanism at that time was not available. But now you see Wall Street taking trailer trash public, trailer parks public, ghettos public. I mean, this trend is only going to get worse.
So here's the American dream. Over in America, where they have these trailer parks, 6% of the population live in a Waffle House in which they're chained to the booths, consuming these waffles all day. And the only way out is to give the guy, the toll booth operator at the door, $5,000. And you'll never be able to accumulate $5,000. Why? Because you're chained to the booth at the Waffle House. So this is what the American dream has become.
Well, a lot of people would enjoy the idea of being chained to a Waffle House, but of course there's a limit to how many waffles will be allocated to the dwellers of the Waffle House booths. At some point, the waffles are going to get thinner and thinner. Pretty soon, syrup will run out, and you'll be chained to a waffleless Waffle House, which is equivalent to the Haitians eating mud pies.
Now that guy, Frank Rolfe, he does run a thing called the Mobile Home University, where for $1,900 he could teach you how to get into this business and you make 20% returns. But in fact, it's very difficult to find these mobile home parks to buy because Sam Zell owns most of them. He owns something like 71,500 of them. So it's impossible to get into the market because, as I said, there's no new ones. But there's some investors are feeling more like they want to improve the lives of these people there, and they're like better of these trailer park owners, they say. Dan Weissman and David Schlachter take pride in improving the lives of residents in some of the more rundown parks they've bought. And they say owning trailer parks has taught them what it's like to be poor in America. Many tenants can't get bank accounts because they have wretched credit. Instead, they use prepaid debit cards that charge a fee of as much as $4 to load just $20 onto them. It's expensive to be poor, Schlachter says. He goes on to say that the biggest eye-opener to him was that finding out how so many capable people have been banished to poverty by simple mistakes. So he uses those people to be his enforcers in these in these ghetto trailer parks where he sends them to collect the money from the residents. But he's saying it's simple mistakes. This is the American dream where you get chained to a waffle table, a waffle booth at a Waffle House because of some stupid mistake you made.
Well, I'm not sure what he means by simple mistakes. I mean, this fellow Schlachter obviously suffers from narcissistic paranoia complex coupled with the availability of ultra-low, cheap credit, who can then create these slum dwellings on behalf of his income recipients. And he, in fact, is part of the reason why you have these slums and ghettos in America, by people abusing the system, becoming a rentier class, becoming an overlords on a permanent underclass that's now developing in America. These people will never rise out of the ghetto, out of the trailer trash, because they'll never have access to education. They won't have access to rights, civil rights, human rights. They won't have access to the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. They have access to nothing. They're simply cogs in a wheel spinning in a Waffle House, generating income for Schlachter and his Wall Street Sharpies, who are basically pathological liars, putting together financializations that are buttressed by a Bank of England and a Federal Reserve Bank that are answer to no one but their own narcissism.
Right, but he does point out some of the mistakes, and the next story we're going to go into is uncovering some of these sort of mistakes that can land you in poverty for eternity, the rest of your life anyway. And John Berger's, the rest of his quote that you started off with goes that the 20th century consumer economy has produced the first culture for which a beggar is a reminder of nothing, because there's no sense to it. It's just random mistakes that you forgot to read the small print, or you didn't know about the small print because it was invisible, written in invisible ink perhaps by some too big to fail bank. So you go on to the next story where pensioner fights bullying parking eye as it takes 1,000 drivers a week to court. So there's this company run by Capita, which is one of these outsourced companies that the government outsources all their services of the privatized industry to them. But they've been handed all these parking lots, as we call them in America, car parks, as they call them here, National Health Service and Aldi and various supermarket chains. But they've been bombarding people with court orders to demand to pay. But this past week, Northumbria Healthcare NHS Foundation Trust terminated its contract with Parking Eye at its 3 hospitals in Northumberland and North Tyneside because it says visitors found the system difficult and it caused anxiety to our patients and visitors, and we have acted on this. So they go over these people being dragged into court because of an overly complex system, which is just simply parking your car between two yellow lines. And yet they add all of these small print, all sorts of signs to confuse people, and then people end up getting eviscerated financially and end up in some trailer park.
Right. Well, the problem with capitalism is that eventually you run out of other people's money to steal, which is equally true of capitalism. What Margaret Thatcher said about socialism is that they're both bankrupt ideologies at the end of the day. You see that now with the capitalist rise post-socialist Britain, and you have the advent of now the financialization and securitization of every single scintilla of the public domain to the detriment of all. And I mean, if this guy like Schlachter and others were allowed to merge biotechnology and financialization, they'd be having people's left lung go to war with their right lung, and to try to buy out the right lung and replace it with a kidney, and have that kidney collateralized to pump the stomach to create the liquidities to do a leverage buyout of the brain. And then we're going to dissect the brain, and we're going to give it as the income-producing bio-natural assets to keep the heart pumping. So at the end, this is a Frankenstein monster of basically vivisection gone Wall Street, with parts of human bodies scattered on the tabletop. The Dr. Frankenstein getting a fee on all this vivisection and amputation and dissembling, and nevertheless, all the people involved are on the table in scrap heaps or in ghettos, or having had experimentation on them done by these same cheap credit-fueled Frankenstein-modeled investment bankers, who again are pumped to life by the cheap credit from the central bankers, who are the ultimate purveyor of this kind of capitalism slash fatalism.
Yeah, or they end up chained to a table at a Waffle House, and this Capita firm, they made £8 million profit on £25 million income just on running these sort of services.
But it's not profit. People. It's not profit. It's just they stole.
Yeah.
The capitalist model at this point is just stealing money, because what they leave behind is a scorched earth. It's completely inoperable. Those trailer parks are now, the next step for those people will be prison and then the incinerator. That's the way fascism works. Capitalism in its end game. And that's what we see in the United States. These people are going to be sent out to the privately owned, leverage buyout, Auschwitz-like conditions in America, thanks to Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and the rest of Wall Street. But we got to go. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to the Waffle House.
All right, stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Alistair McLeod of GoldMoney.com. Alistair, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
That's my pleasure, Max.
All right, I want to talk about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. A lot of people don't really understand what's going on with this organization. Talk a little bit about it.
Well, it's very important because China and Russia set up the SCO, and everybody thinks China is the main player. It may well be, for all I know. But it started off as a security agreement, because at the time, I think back in around about the year 2000, the Russians were worried about the Chechens and all the rest of it, and the Chinese have a very, very disparate population of some 40 different ethnic groups. They're worried about potential disruption amongst them. So it made sense to start it off as a security operation. And it's morphed from there into an economic cooperation. Cross-border infrastructure projects, for example, hydroelectricity from Siberia to China, railways, roads, and so on and so forth.
Okay, the reason this comes up is that recently, with the Crimea, then Ukraine, we understand that China and Russia are talking about creating a trade zone in that area to start trading energy in something other than the US dollar. So then this plays, of course, into gold. So we got 3 points of the triangle here. We've got this SCO, you've got the recent activities in Ukraine as it relates to a Chinese, Russian, Eurasian trade bloc emerging, and how it relates to gold. But just first of all, Am I correct in saying that the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, dovetails pretty seamlessly into this new Eurasian trade zone that's sprung up in the wake of Ukraine-Crimea situation?
Yes, the trade zone already exists. I mean, I would say the difference between the EU and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is that when a Chinaman or a Russian turns up on your doorstep, he doesn't tell you how to behave and then say, can we trade? He just says, can we trade? And that very much is the Asian ethic, if you like, the trade ethic. And it not only includes them, that there are very important countries queuing up to join this lot. It includes Iran, so that takes them onto the Persian Gulf. It also includes India, for example, and that's another 1.3 billion people.
That's very interesting you mentioned India, because India has jumped over to support Russia recently. So India is not in the U.S. pocket. They're not in the EU's pocket. They're very much part of this SCO, China-Russia trade zone. Isn't that correct?
That's correct. And I think if it's almost as if the Asian nations are beginning to look into themselves for their future rather than looking towards the West. And I think that's a very, very important point to understand.
Right, and of course that means getting out of the dollar, which means a bigger emphasis on gold. And China, I've been reading your stuff recently, they've been accumulating a lot more gold than I think most people understand.
Yes, that's right. I mean, on the currency front, first of all, China and Russia have always wanted to get away from trade settlements in dollars. And we saw last year, the tail end of last year, there were so many trade visits from the UK, and they were all going to talk about how do we get more liquidity into the Chinese currency, trading in London and so on and so forth. London is the place of choice with Hong Kong, its natural nexus, rather than New York. And the Americans have been frozen out of this almost entirely, which is a very interesting point, and I think behind it all is this desire to get away from using the dollar.
You know, I made a film, Stacey Herbert and I did, called The Death of the Dollar, which featured James Turk over there at goldmoney.com as well. And at that time, Iraq was trying to get out of the dollar and trade oil in euros. And we know what happened to Iraq. Iran, of course, talking about trading oil in something other than the dollar. We know that all the sanctions that are on Iran. Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, talking about bringing in a pan-African gold-backed currency to get out of the dollar. He's gone. So is this going to be the relationship to break through the U.S. dollar policy, which, according to Dr. Michael Hudson or Catherine Austin Fitts, it's a currency backed by the Pentagon. You take our dollars or we blow you up. Is this going to be finally a breakthrough?
I think that the policy of trying to persuade, trying to attack people by saying we will not permit you to trade in the dollar is something that you might be able to use very sparingly once or twice, but it's becoming so frequent that actually I think it's going to drive the dollar out of trade settlement. I mean, the Chinese yuan is already the second largest settlement currency for cross-border trade. It is even more used than the euro. So, the bones of it are already there. And then we get this gas deal between Gazprom and China. As far as I'm concerned...
What is that gas deal between Gazprom and China?
Basically, Russia has come to an agreement with China that, here's another outlet for Russia's gas. So if, let us say...
Is that a done deal?
Yeah, it's a done deal, basically. I mean, this sort of thing has been in the works for a long time. It's the whole reason for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The timing from moment to moment you can't predict, but I think it was an absolute dead cert that this is the way Russian energy policy was going anyway. And then, of course, the other thing, you mentioned Iran. Russia will become, if you like, the handler for all Iran's oil, if she's not already. So, and that makes her even
more... It totally goes around the sanctions.
Yeah, and it makes Russia even more powerful in the energy field. She is already herself the world's largest energy exporter. And at the same time...
Ahead of Saudi Arabia.
Ahead of Saudi Arabia. And at the same time, America, with shale oil on all the rest of it, we're told that America is now going to, become a net exporter of energy. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not, but the point is that the demand for energy from America is definitely dropping and will continue to fall. So that changes the balance of interest in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia's main client is no longer America. It is now China and the rest of the Eurasian continent. So again, we see everything in Eurasia, if you like, and particularly the Asian bit, all sort of moving in together, and they're all working together. That is where their future is, cooperating with each other, rather than trading with America. and Western Europe, who keep on putting conditions on the basis of trade.
Let's talk petrodollar. So, of course, 1971, America defaulted on this bond, essentially. They closed the gold window. They went on the petrodollar, which is that relationship between Saudi Arabia and America. The quid pro quo, we'll send you the oil, it's got to be in dollars. That's been the modern history. Are we entering into a post-petrodollar world, and would it be a petro-yuan or a petro-ruble? What would you call it?
Well, it's definitely post-petrodollar because, as I've just said, Arabia, if you like, the Gulf region is going to be exporting less to America, is already exporting less to America, so there is less use for the dollar. How the currencies work out at the end of the day, I really don't know. What I do know is that the Gulf region is a very, very big owner of gold. I know China is a very big owner of gold. Places like Turkey and Iran are also big owners of gold. And Russia is also a reasonably big owner of gold. So gold is common throughout it. I don't necessarily see gold convertibility being put into these currencies because otherwise these currencies would go up very substantially against the dollar. I think it is more likely they will continue to try and manage the currencies against the dollar. But they have got gold, if you like, as the backstop for payment, which gives confidence, if you like, behind the overall trade between the countries.
Right, so they're doing a lot of bilateral currency swaps between these countries. I guess now looking back, you wouldn't call it really the petrodollar, it's the Saudi dollar, which emerged after 1971. So we're moving from the Saudi dollar to, which is, our Aramco was, Arabian oil, American oil. I mean, it was this huge merger of these two interests. So now we're into post-Saudi dollar. We're into some kind of new dollar diminishment of a currency that's backed, primarily by these assets, by natural gas. And finally, people have been saying, let's get a asset-backed currency, natural resource-backed currency. It looks like we're heading in that direction, which brings us, of course, back to gold. So you're talking about certain gold being trapped, as they say. What is this all about?
Well, China has acquired an awful lot of gold. I mean, a lot more than we think in the West. I have calculated that since 2008, including 2008 to 2013, something like 13,000 tons has been acquired by China and its people. Of that, around about 4,000 tons has been acquired by the government itself. They've had mine production before that period as well, which has probably added another 2,000 or 3,000 tons to it. So what we can see is that there has been huge, huge demand.
Okay, so they're approaching, what is owned by the continent of India.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we don't know how much India owns.
But it's roughly 20,000 tons is the number bandied about.
I think you've now got three real sort of gold centres. You've got from the petrodollar time, going back into the 70s, you've got the Arab nations, including Saudi Arabia, you've got India, and you've now also got China. And don't forget the Chinese diaspora. I mean, they behave in the same sort of way. As far as everyone in Asia is concerned, gold is, if you like, the family pension fund. And that's why they acquire it. It's a completely different mindset from what we're used to in these markets.
Well, let's talk about, again, on the geopolitical front. You've got these sanctions, Russia, the cutting off Russia from Visa and MasterCard. The SWIFT, remember they used the SWIFT system to cut off Iran. Now they're talking about Russia. How does that play into the dollar? Does that hurt or help the dollar?
Well, it hurts the dollar, and I think it is also extremely dangerous because if there is a World War III, and that's a very emotive term, obviously, I think it's likely to be financial rather than military. And certainly the sabres are being rattled on the financial front in a very, very big way. A very small anecdote. There's a guy called Robert Peston who is a BBC man, and he interviewed Hank Paulson. And Hank Paulson was talking about the time of the Lehman crisis. Hank Paulson said that the Chinese had told him that the Russians had got on to them and said, why don't we take out, destabilize Fannie and Freddie? Now, that I find interesting. The Chinese didn't go with it, and whether the Chinese made it up to try and put pressure on Hank Paulson, we don't know. But I think it does show that if we start mucking around with them on a financial front, the consequences, I think, for ourselves could be very, very dangerous.
Right, so I read this story, Robert Peston, and so you're giving credence to the story, or you think it's an interesting development.
Well, it was in his blog, so
it's in his blog, it's an anecdote. In other words, Chinese were engaging in financial war at the time of the 2008 crisis, when things were looking wobbly and Lehman Brothers was collapsing, they came in and...
I think, Max, the point was that the Chinese at that stage were major creditors and had to be kept on side through the process. That was why Hank Paulson was talking to them.
Yeah.
But the Russians were not really in that position. But they could see that this was an opportunity for them to, make fun, if you like, or make hay, or however you like to put it, at the Americans' expense.
And they had the wherewithal to do that.
Absolutely. And the important point about all this gold that China has bought is that she is now in a position to switch the value in her US treasuries into her own gold just by ramping up the gold price. So we don't want to go to war with a senior member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think it would be very, very dangerous. Yes, that's the takeaway, precisely. And this is why the Ukrainian thing is actually so serious, because if these things can escalate, and they do tend to escalate. And if that happens, I think the whole situation could become very unstable.
All right, we got to leave it there, Alistair. Thanks so much for being again on the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much, Max.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Alistair McLeod of goldmoney.com. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.